Welcome to the Yeoman Podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Graham. Excited to have with me today Clay Routledge. Clay is an existential psychologist who specializes in nostalgia. He is the executive vice president and chief operating officer of the Human Flourishing Lab at the Archbridge Institute. It's a nonpartisan think tank. Clay is an author of, in 2018, published Death, Meaning, and the Power of the Invisible World, and more recently, Past Forward, How Nostalgia Can Help You Live a More Meaningful Life. That was in 2023. Many other books and articles. You may have seen relatively recently some of his writing going around about Gen Z and nostalgia, and in particular, how there are aspects of nostalgia that are very, very positive psychologically for us. And I think we'll talk about that. I think just to share my personal experience or interest in the topic, when I began my professional career, it's in real estate development and construction, and very much focused with an emphasis on classicism, traditional architecture, vernacular architecture, and historic forms of human settlement, really walkability and things like that. And this was in the mid-late 90s, in kind of the establishment architects, land planners, and people like that, for developers, architects, builders who were doing things like this, they very loudly derided it as nostalgic, using that term as a criticism, as a dismissive criticism. You also saw this with the princes were developing Poundbury, the new town, or it was a new town in the 90s in the UK. It's kind of derided as nostalgic, didn't have a place in the modern world or any of those sorts of things. And more recently, I just have kind of having experienced that and noticed it, I have observed critics of a lot of things, like deriding and dismissing things as nostalgic. It continues to this day with the emphasis on kind of people trying to revive walkability in our land use patterns, but also in agriculture, with regard to regenerative agriculture being dismissed as nostalgic and no longer having a place. And then too, I most recently read an architecture and urbanism critic who I actually think very highly of, dismissed this, what I think is kind of a back to the land movement, or a desire to experience more rural lifestyle, or even country music and a lot of the themes in there. Mm-hmm. She derided it as nostalgic and out of step with the times. I'm like, that doesn't feel right to me. And it reminded me of Clay's work, and he had written some things very recently that I just read. So it's like, I'd really love to explore this topic with him. So Clay, thank you so much for joining us on Yeoman.
Thank you for having me. It's great to join you.
Yeah. I thought I'd start and ask, maybe I'll read some quotes from your work. So you have argued persuasively to me that nostalgia, aspects of nostalgia, can positively connect people to their past and enable them to feel, this is your quote, connected to something larger than themselves, grounding them in a world where stability can seem elusive. You go on and say it can offer, and I'm paraphrasing here, a reassuring foundation from which to move forward, to explore who we are, what we value, and what can bring us peace. I love that, and thought I'd kind of kick it off and ask you if you can begin by sharing sort of the history of the term, or when we started thinking about nostalgia to begin with.
Of course. Now, if you look at literature, you can see what we would consider like the concept or theme of nostalgia to be as old as the written word itself. You know, old stories have this like longing for the past or sentiment for the past. If you look at like the Odyssey, for instance. But it wasn't until 1688 that the term nostalgia was actually coined. And it was coined by a Swiss medical student named Johannes Hofer. And he coined it to represent what he believed to be a brain disease that was affecting specifically Swiss mercenaries who had come down from their Alpine homes to fight wars in the plains of Europe. And what Hofer believed nostalgia to be was a cause of great mental distress associated with a longing for home. So the very early formal conception of nostalgia was very similar to what we might call homesickness. And the idea was that you have these soldiers, they're singing their songs about home, they're telling tales of home, they're longing for home. That's causing them a considerable amount of distress. And so that was the beginning of this idea of like looking backwards is a problem. Looking backwards is a barrier to living in the present, to facing your challenges head on, to moving forward with a sense of optimism or hope. So that started very early, 1688, right? Well, that continued for a while. And it turns out that it wasn't just Swiss mercenaries that were afflicted with nostalgia. All sorts of European soldiers and immigrants, people separated from home, came down with this disease, evidently. Even Union soldiers fighting in the South in the American Civil War were diagnosed with nostalgia. All the way up until World War I, you can see cases of nostalgia being diagnosed by physicians. Mm-hmm. Now, if you go into the 1900s, mid-1900s, and later, you start to see psychologists taking over the term. No one could find any kind of organic brain disease like to confirm the idea that this was a medical condition. But psychologists said, well, maybe this is more of a mental condition, similarly having something to do with distress, anxiety, holding people back from living in the present. There was even some idea from some psychotherapists that nostalgia might reflect a failure to thrive, like a desire to even return to the womb. That persisted well into the late 1900s. But then you started to see some cracks in that perspective. One, advertisers and marketing researchers were noting that people actually like to spend a lot of money on things that remind them of the past. And so that's interesting, right? And they seem to get a lot of pleasure from it. There were some psychologists that noticed that, well, when people are sharing memories, it often brings them some peace and comfort. So this is all anecdotal. This isn't empirical, but they were noting this in their personal experiences with patients and clients. But this view of nostalgia as bad for you persisted, even though it became less of a medical or like a clinical issue. At some point, around that time in the late 1900s, you also started to see researchers who were more specifically or exclusively interested in a longing for home or a missing home, focusing more on homesickness and recognizing that nostalgia might be a broader concept that's not just about a longing for home. It can be a longing for anything from the past. And so homesickness researchers really started to go in their own direction and talk less about nostalgia and talk more about specifically the concept of homesickness. And then nostalgia started to become this other thing that advertising and marketing people got a hold of and really focused on the consumer side of nostalgia. And that started to change its reputation. And yet it still remained that, well, yeah, maybe nostalgia is fun. Maybe it's entertainment. As we get older, maybe we enjoy playing the greatest hits from our youth, but it's still somehow holding us back in some way. And so, the anecdotes you shared are about nostalgia in architecture or in agriculture or in, cultural life are pretty common, that people see nostalgia as a barrier to progress. Interestingly, the public doesn't really share that view. A lot of critics do and a lot of thought leaders do. But we've actually, at the Archbridge Institute, we've done national surveys asking Americans, what they think about nostalgia. And the vast majority of Americans actually see it as a very positive force in their lives. But you're right, this like critical analysis remains. And one quick note I'll end with on that is, I think part of what's going on here, at least, when I read the history of nostalgia myself, part of what's going on is there's a confusion of correlation and causation. And what I mean by that is Hofer, going back to the original 1688 analysis, noticed that Swiss mercenaries were having all sorts of psychological problems: anxiety, disordered eating, distress, insomnia, weight loss, even fevers, even physical symptoms. And they were also singing songs and talking about home.
These are people who just been in war.
Right, exactly. So he was like, oh, it's the singing songs about home and sharing the stories about home that's causing these symptoms. Instead of the possibility, like you said, the symptoms are caused by, fighting and wars in the plains of Europe, and that was making them long for home. So, one possibility is the causal arrow goes the other direction, and that it's going through a difficult time, such as war, makes people nostalgic. And then that opens the possibility of, well, maybe nostalgia is doing something positive for them. And so that, looking back, and again, like these were not like empirical studies. These were just their own observations. But now we have a bunch of empirical studies that actually confirm that nostalgia doesn't make people miserable. When people are miserable, they become more nostalgic, and nostalgia actually has a number of positive psychological benefits.
So people, it's first observed with people leaving their homes, going to a new place, maybe experiencing trauma in their lives or whatever, having a longing for where they came from. Did people attempt to treat it if it was regarded as a disease or an illness or something like that?
One of the ways to treat it was to ban singing, was to ban the using it. So to stop people from singing these songs. Yeah. So there was an attempt to, it's almost like if you think of like alcoholism or something, like the way of treating it is to say, stop doing it, like is to prevent the behavior. And so that was, early on, I think that was a big strategy. Now, as you get more into the mid 20th century and the kind of psychodynamic tradition, therapeutic treatments were more, I think, around the idea of trying to get people to get to the root cause of like why they're nostalgic to begin with. So there were attempts to treat it. It's funny because there were other theories too, such as demon possession, or even the idea that the funniest one being the idea that maybe it has something to do with the cowbells in the Alps. Right. And the clinging to the cowbells might be causing damage to the middle ear in some way, which is causing this like pressure changes coming down from the Alps, even causing like the sentiment in the heart. And so there were all these sorts of other ways of thinking about it too. And so it's kind of it's got a really, really wild history. But even to your point about like the present day. Like one of the ways, now we don't treat nostalgia, we don't see it as a clinical condition anymore, but like the same sentiment of it being a problem, people, similarly say, well, we just need to discourage nostalgia, and that it's almost treated as like a distraction or like a human weakness. It's something that we should root out
of, like you should. Yeah.
Right. So even in the non-clinical sense, we very much have this idea that, well, it's a barrier to flourishing, it's a barrier to progress, and so people should just not try to avoid it. And so there is a lot of efforts to like, shame. Use kind of shame is like, oh, you should be like, you're closed-minded, you're uncreative, you're dogmatic, you're boring. You're stuck in the past, and so like stop doing that stuff.
So you've written about the manner. So that's the kind of that brings us to today, where what the clinical profession or the critical class or whatever it is thinks about nostalgia, and I'd like to hear you talk about. How it can play a positive role for people, particularly young people, But before that, something occurred to me when you're sharing sort of the history of the word and its connection to homesickness.
Mm-hmm.
This is not my observation, but others have made it and I see it. There seems to be in our times a bit of oikophobia, or sort of a kind of the inverse of homesickness, where you are kind of raised or enculturated to dislike where you come from, to hate your home. It didn't occur to me until you shared that connection between the word homesickness and or the connection between homesickness and nostalgia. But I wonder if this kind of cultural oikophobia, like where we come from is bad, and other places are better, but our place is bad. I wonder if that is sort of a similar connected to.
Yeah, that's an interesting. I hadn't actually thought about that before. I know what you're talking about, and yeah, you could imagine that being associated with sort of the stigma that remains among some people about nostalgia. It's interesting too, because I was a professor for a long time, and in academia there is not. I'm not saying everyone's like this, but it's common to come across this view of being critical of Western traditions and societies in our history, and there's a sort of kind of anti-rootedness perspective, but while at the same time very much admiring that in other cultures, and fighting to preserve that in other cultures, recognizing that in other cultures there's some sense of history and people wanting to feel continuity, cultural continuity, like they know where their people came from, and they want to continue their stories and pass down their traditions. And so that is something that I found sort of interesting when I was an academic is this. It's like there's a recognition that that's important. Culture is important, history is important, but not in our society, right? We're always supposed to be looking forward. We're always supposed to be changing. We're not supposed to be rooted, and that's not. I don't see that amongst everyday people. I don't think share that view, but there is like an intellectual sort of prejudice, I guess you could say, that it's consistent. And like you said, I think that definitely aligns with this like negativity towards nostalgia.
It's interesting that the regular people who haven't read a paper on the topic or written a paper on the topic have positive views of nostalgia, like, we want to go to Disney and check out sort of the main street, which is very nostalgic, or we want to listen to country music that talks about life growing up on the farm or dirt roads or those sorts of things. Yeah. Like common people feeling that way, or looking at architecture and finding traditional architecture, front porches, columns, those sorts of things. Who's that? The famous artist that gets very popular artist, but gets panned by critics. The painter of light. I'm blanking on his name. Passed away, but they're always sort of quaint scenes. Like all those things are derided in kind of an intellectual class, but just regular people, they think that's great.
Yeah, I think so.
So will you chat? Let's turn to sort of how nostalgia can play how it does and how it can play a positive role in our lives, particularly for young people.
Yeah. So about 25 years ago, nearly, I was part of an international research team where we wanted to explore this question. When I was in graduate school working on my PhD, I was actually very interested in how humans think about the future and sort of the psychological consequences of that, because we know thinking about the future has a number of positive benefits, right? It's how we organize and plan and envision a world of tomorrow and, build lives and have goals and all of that. But that ability to ponder the unknown, what hasn't happened yet, the future is uncertain, can create a fair amount of anxiety in our lives. And so I was interested in how people grapple with that anxiety, and particularly the existential anxiety inherent to that. And, then I started thinking, not just me, but, my colleagues and I started thinking, well, the same ability to travel to the future we might use to travel to the past to help us deal with the anxiety about the future. So we started doing studies to see if, for instance, when people think about an unpleasant future topic like their death, if that makes them more nostalgic, if that nostalgia reduces anxiety. And we found evidence for that. So early on, our view was, well, nostalgia, we were pretty agnostic on whether nostalgia was a barrier to progress at that point. Well, what our view was is, well, at a minimum, nostalgia seems to be like a coping mechanism or a psychological defense. Maybe it's got some negative consequences, but it might have these psychological benefits, because if you're overwhelmed by anxiety, you're not going to be able to move forward with life very productively.
What would be an example of like a well-known coping mechanism or a well-regarded coping mechanism?
What would be an example of a
well-known coping mechanism that would be like familiar to people?
I think anything like relationships, like people talk about, like, if you're going through stress, like talking to someone is a good way to cope with problems. And so what we thought is, or exercise, right? Like there are lots of things that we learn that are like good for stress management. And so what we thought is nostalgia
necessarily remove the root cause of the stress, but it enables you to deal with it in your life.
Right. It's a strategy that you can use to like fortify yourself to help overcome, gives you kind of the confidence and the motivation, like to overcome, as like you said, as opposed to addressing a root cause. And so we do this in lots of other ways, right? We think about eating healthy or exercise or things like that mitigates, unrelated, stressors.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what we thought. Well, maybe nostalgia is just this sort of natural coping mechanism that we use, and we found some evidence for that. But then, we started to realize there was very little known about nostalgia empirically. There was all this writing that we've talked about in the history of nostalgia, but nearly all of it was anecdotal, theoretical, qualitative, or relied on very, very basic surveys, correlations. And so we thought, well, we need to do some experimental testing where we randomly assign people to be nostalgic or not, and then test its effects, and where we do look at different ways of inducing psychological states and see what triggers nostalgia. So we really wanted to use the modern empirical experimental tools to put nostalgia under the microscope in a way it just hadn't been, in all those years. And what we started to discover is nostalgia doesn't make people distressed. Distress makes people nostalgic. Not just distress, but, more broadly, humans are never really satisfied, right? There's always something we're frustrated with, something we think could be better. And this can make us miserable, but it is also how we're a progress-oriented species. We're problem solvers, right? We want, we get something, we think, oh, it's pretty good, but, we could tinker with it and make it a little bit better. And, that's kind of the story of the human condition is, always looking for ways to make improvements. And so that kind of dissatisfaction, whether it's a social dissatisfaction, like we're lonely, we're not satisfied with our current relationships, we think they could be better, or it's a professional dissatisfaction, like, I'm not in the job I want, or like a life goal. It's like, oh, I'm not satisfied with like my level of fitness. Regardless of what it is, you can think about these things in which that are negative affect that make us distressed in some way. What we found is under those conditions of dissatisfaction or distress, or even just uncertainty, people often naturally look backwards for inspiration. They pull from experiences from their past that have been fulfilling or useful, and they draw strength from that. So, to use the example of loneliness. So a person moves to a new city. They don't really know anyone. And they tend to be very nostalgic, kind of like in the example I provided about homesickness, right? Of soldiers fighting wars far from home, or immigrants moving to a new country. you're lonely, you start thinking about home, and your relationships at home. What that does is it helps you step outside of your current moment of dissatisfaction to see a bigger picture and to realize that, yeah, right now you're not totally satisfied, but you've collected over the years a number of meaningful life experiences that have been fulfilling. And so you've had successful relationships in the past, for instance, you can do so again. And so what we started to discover is not only does nostalgia reduce anxiety or provide psychological comfort, it actually has this motivational component. It helps people feel confident that they can solve their current challenges and that they can make life better, which is very counter to what the critics that we were previously talking about think. Because their view is, even if they will grant that nostalgia might offer some psychological comfort, many of them often still see that comfort is not useful, because what they want to say is, well, nostalgia might make you feel good, but then you won't do anything to improve your situation. Mm-hmm. But what we found is that by not only does nostalgia make you feel good, it motivates you to want to improve your situation. So to your point about maybe a more naturalistic historical nostalgia. So you might have somebody saying, wow, I live in an urban environment and, there's not a lot of green spaces. And, that makes me nostalgic for a time where, I was out in the country and doing these things. It's not people saying, well, I don't want to, I want to live like people lived in the past. They're saying there's elements of the past that would be actually improve the present and help us build a better future. So even in the case of a broader, what we might call a historical nostalgia, whether it's involving architecture, nature, fashion, art, oftentimes what people are doing is they're saying, no, I don't want to return to the world of the past. I want to pull from the past ideas that can help me improve the present and the future.
That strikes me as, I'm obviously not a psychologist, but I have understood the quip that depression is kind of pain attached to trauma in the past, and anxiety is concern about the future. Mm-hmm. And it strikes me that the way you describe nostalgia there, it's kind of the inverse of both of those. It's a recognition that there have been times in the past where things are really, really good, and I can relive those in my mind and possibly manifest those things again today. So maybe there's a hopeful aspect to it.
Yeah. And to your point, it is very much like a cognitive reframing or perspective taking exercise that probably implicates a number of other psychological strategies that have been shown to be effective at helping people move forward with resilience, things like gratitude. And we find, for instance, that in a lot of nostalgic narratives, people express a sense of gratitude for what they've had, even in the case in which there's loss. So one thing I didn't mention, but I think it's worth mentioning, is nostalgia isn't always just pure happy memories. So when we collect nostalgic narratives, which we do, we've gone to people all over the world and asked them to share with us, oftentimes in writing or audio recording, to share with us something that makes them nostalgic, an experience from their life that makes them nostalgic. And what we found is in a decent proportion of these, there's both negative and positive emotional words. People aren't just saying, "Oh, I went on this beach vacation; it was awesome." I mean, people have those memories too. But some of the most powerful nostalgic memories involve people overcoming life difficulties or going through something that had negative components, but then they came out the other side. And I think one of the ways that nostalgia works is when we're separated by something a little bit with time, we've had more time to make sense of it, right? To draw the wisdom or to pull a lesson from it. And so that's why you will sometimes have people, having nostalgic memories that are complicated, ambivalent. But what's interesting is revisiting those memories doesn't seem to make them sad. There might be like a little tinge of loss, a little tinge of sadness, but it's overwhelmed by positive emotion. So somebody might talk about, you can think about this when we think about loved ones that we've lost. People have a lot of nostalgic memories with family members or friends that are no longer with us. And thinking about that gives us that tinge of sadness because we miss them. But it's usually overwhelmed by this gratitude, this appreciation of how important that relationship was, how much it changed your life for the better. And, and that in itself gives some sense of like forward-looking inspiration of like, oh, I should really think about privileging relationships. They're really important. It's easy to get distracted with stupid stuff in life, but I should focus on what's meaningful. So that's another, I think, benefit of nostalgia. Not only is it a reframing or an ability to make sense of your help make sense of your situation, it's also kind of a focusing effect. Like it tends to help you prioritize what's most meaningful in your life.
Would it be, I'm thinking about this in my own life, or I suppose then I don't think about it normally as being nostalgic for me to look back on particularly difficult things that I have no desire to relive. Like I don't want to relive that thing.
Yeah.
But I do reflect on those things a great deal and draw on those things to help me kind of put in context what's happening today and know that there is, and know that things can be overcome or there's positive aspects to it or that sort of thing.
Yeah, for sure. And there are different types of autobiographical like reflections, and they don't all give us that kind of warm, nostalgic feeling for sure. And, we can draw lessons from those. But what's interesting, I think, is when
regret, I guess, would be something.
Yeah, for sure. And sometimes, and of course, humans are complex. Like we can experience kind of multiple things simultaneously. And so a lot of times I think what's happening is nostalgia is woven in there a little bit. It's not the only thing happening, but it gives us that's, we often weave it in, or it becomes triggered by thinking about like a difficult life experience. So for instance, I might look back on, my father dying and it makes me sad. And, maybe I'll have some regrets associated with that. Like, oh, I should have, I lived far away. I wish I would have made more in an effort to spend time with him. And so all that can be unpleasant, but then that usually triggers like positive experiences. And in a lot of ways, those positive experiences help keep, they're not only help me think about ways to improve, to be like, oh, well, in the future, I'm going to find, I don't want to repeat my mistakes, but there's also this sense of it's a way to have an ongoing dialogue or relationship, because I find this when I think about people that I've lost in my life. It's like I still, in a way, I'm not like consciously talking to them, but I bring to mind these memories with them and I find them useful. So as I get older, I'm like, oh yeah, my dad, something that frustrated me that my dad said, like now I realize that I'm a certain age, like that was usually useful information. And then now I have kind of a different take on what, maybe at a previous point in my life wouldn't have been as nostalgic of a memory. Now it becomes more nostalgic. So another way of saying that is, the way our relationship with the past is dynamic. And sometimes what seems like it's not a nostalgic memory right now might end up becoming a nostalgic memory later, because I'm facing a different challenge and I get a different, I can take a different perspective on it.
You and one of the quotes I read from you in the beginning, you talked about and this, you speaking about your dad or other things reminded me of this. Like there's a big aspect of grounding.
Yeah.
Like in a world where we are very mobile, transient, different places, like the profession we might have nothing to do with the profession that our parents or ancestors have. We may be in an entirely new place. We begin to have this, existential crisis about who are we? And
yes.
What are we doing? And the nostalgia reminds us that we have roots and we came from a place and a people and a culture and these sorts of things, and help us avoid the anxiety, frustration, nihilism, whatever that might come from all this cultural atomization that we're surrounded by.
Absolutely. And, there's this concept in psychology called self-continuity, and it's the idea that at some level humans want to feel, even though we like change, we like to grow, we like to think that we develop in a positive direction, we still want to have a sense of continuous identity of like, we know who we are. We have an authentic sense of self that's rooted in a broader social and cultural continuity. It's why we fear things so much like cognitive decline, right? Like this loss of self, that maybe I won't remember who I am, we have a lot of understandable fears around that. And, so I think that's part of it, that rootedness. And then that also, earlier I kind of sort of went back and forth without much explanation between like personal nostalgia and historical nostalgia. So that would be a nostalgia for a time that doesn't include our own personal memories, but where and people do both, but there is a connection that's related to what you're talking about, which is we want to have our personal stories. Like we want to have our own rootedness of who we are and where we come from, but that's situated in a broader cultural story. And so sometimes our nostalgia isn't even our own, but we want to connect it to ourselves. And this is what I think is so interesting about Gen Z or young people who are experiencing quite a bit of cultural and historical nostalgia. And a big part of that is they want to know, where they fall into the bigger story. Mm-hmm. And they're very interested in that, in addition to specific challenges their generation is facing around rapid technological change and upheaval. There is the sense of rootedness, and that rootedness is like not just my own personal rootedness. Where do I come from? But where does that fit into the bigger narrative? I think is important.
Well, I'm so glad you brought that. So am I right in thinking you'd call that historical nostalgia rather than personal nostalgia?
Yeah.
And you had said earlier, I don't think I got this fully, people pull from their experiences in their past and draw strength from that. I was going to ask, and I think you brought it up, like, well, what about like intergenerational experiences? Not their experiences, but experiences that precede them. And I do think about, this was the criticism I heard cast toward country music. I love country music. I love old country music. I love new country music. A thing with new country music that you really see is like a lot of what these songwriters are praising or talking about living, they haven't lived. Like it is a thing. There's many aspects of it that were a thing but it's largely gone from most places in the world, but they are singing about it, writing about it, and singing about it in a very, very positive way. And that clearly is not from their experiences. Like they might have grown up in sort of suburban Nashville or Australia, wherever they were. But it is echoing through time to them, to the way they know that there were things about it. They're getting glimmers of it from a different time. So is that part of what you mean with historic nostalgia?
Yeah, absolutely. And, one element of it that to me is very fascinating is how technology is contributing to that, especially for Gen Z. So how do people think about or experience like a time before them? Well, maybe in the past you read books, right? And this is what life was like in this era. But it's interesting now you're seeing a lot of Gen Z watch videos from a time not that far before them, but still before them. Like they might be watching on YouTube, evidently people put these videos up of this is what life was like in high school in the 1990s. Mm-hmm. What they're doing is they're saying, there was a time before smartphones when you could just talk to people. Your mistake, think dumb things you said didn't get, posted on social media, or you weren't going to get canceled, or like there was just less, anxiety about that sort of online surveillance, I guess. And so they're saying that, but they're learning about this they're using technology to learn about it. And then what's kind of cool, and this isn't from any research we've done, it's just more anecdotally talking to young people, because we have done surveys on Gen Z historical nostalgia. So we do have good empirical evidence that the majority of Gen Z adults say they are nostalgic for a time before they were alive. So we definitely have evidence for that. But just talking to young people anecdotally about, how they're experiencing this. One thing I think is interesting, and it speaks to your point about the intergenerational component, is they might learn about this by seeing something on YouTube or TikTok. But then oftentimes that sparks a conversation with an older family member, an older coworker, or something like that, where they want to talk about it. They want those experiences shared with them. And this isn't an observation from me, but I've talked to other people who have made the point that we have fewer opportunities now, perhaps, for intergenerational dialogue or even shared cultural experiences. Yeah. So when you and I were kids, we just the whole family watched one TV, and we kind of shared the content. Maybe the kids could watch Saturday morning cartoons or something like that, but there was a lot more shared experiences, where now everyone has their own little screen and their own very specialized, algorithm driven content. Even my login for the Netflix is going to bring up different stuff than my wife's, right? Because we watch different things. And so
to that, for us, people not much older than us, it was much more likely, I think, that we would know our grandparents.
Yes.
Parents were you had children at a younger age, but most people are having children at an older age.
That's right.
Smaller families, and you combine those things together, and it's I imagine a considerably smaller chance that a young person today will have had a meaningful relationship.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. People are having, fewer kids, and then they're, like you said, they're having them at older ages. And so there's a lot less opportunity for that kind of intergenerational content.
Or geographically, we're
we're much more mobile. Or like I said, our entertainment is much more specialized. So there are all these different forces through technology and lifestyle that, to your point, are making intergenerational contact lower, perhaps. But you can see that young people are craving that, I think, and they're looking online to make contact with it. And then, ideally, this would be an opportunity for more real life intergenerational content, where people would say, oh, this seems like you guys did this. It was life really. I remember when I was a kid, and I would go over to my grandmother's house, and my grandmother was old enough to where she rode a horse to school. And she told me about riding a horse to school. And I just thought that was absolutely wild.
Yeah.
Even as a
school, I bet you were like, damn.
I know. I was like, I have to ride the stupid bus. So yeah, just, those kinds of experiences, I think you're right. There's fear of those, but I think young people are longing for those types of experiences because they also want to feel rooted and connected. I've done some consulting work with organizations, and that's actually a theme that's come up with young employees, is that there's this idea that young people aren't that interested in history. They got the whole lives to look forward to, they are looking forward, not backwards. And what some surveys have revealed with Gen Z and millennial workers is actually they want more to learn more about the history of the organization they work for. They want to feel more rooted in it. And so, this kind of view of young people don't, they don't want to, they don't want to feel rooted, or they don't care about the past. I don't think is necessarily true. I mean, yes, they have other motives and concerns that can maybe make it look like they're not interested. And based on the work we've done, we found there's actually quite a hunger for this sense of groundedness that you're talking about, especially in times of rapid change. I mean, one of the discoveries we made with nostalgia is people can feel nostalgic at any time for lots of reasons. And sometimes it's just a direct sensory trigger. We hear an old song and it brings back a memory, right? We run into an old friend and it's like, oh, how are you doing? And remember the time. So we definitely have those, just kind of normal nostalgic encounters. But what we find is that nostalgia tends to increase during times of major upheaval. So during the COVID-19 pandemic, Spotify shared data on what people were listening to. Not surprisingly, people were listening to more music because they were stuck at home and they had, maybe they had more time to listen to music. But what they found is that people were especially listening to old music. So the amount of time people were spending listening to older music went up. This has happened with video streaming services as well. There was a increase in people watching old television shows, sitcoms like Friends. So Gen Z loves watching shows like Friends.
Totally binged Friends.
Yeah,
I think during COVID.
So to me, it's like there's something going on there where they're trying to understand like the past. They're trying to understand what life was like, and then maybe it's not. I'm not saying like young people are consciously saying, oh, I want to watch Friends to learn how to talk to people without social media. I just think that's kind of we're social creatures, and that's sort of what we do. We look for opportunities to kind of solve our problems. And I think young people who grew up, online, where digital devices were everywhere, are very much interested in learning how to be offline more. Mm-hmm. And they're looking for any guidance they can on that.
Yeah. It occurs to me, on the one hand, and with modernity and technology, and you have all these things trying to pull you out of the world and onto your screen. But at the same time, as you say, we also, young people in particular, have access to what the world was like before more than anyone else before them. They can see. They can at least see, they can't smell or touch or feel, but they can at least see, some reflections of what the world had been like before them. And I wonder if that is helping Gen Z to better articulate what sort of world they want to have. Like content, like their nostalgia, their sort of, I think, historical nostalgia, is enabling them to see past times before them, assess the good and bad from those, and when they articulate the future that they'd like to have, they can more clearly do so informed by the past than the generations that preceded them that had less clarity into, though I guess the generations preceding them had less rapidity of change too, probably.
Right.
I wonder if there's something real positive in there for them.
Yeah, I think so. Like you said, I mean, there's a lot more data available to them, and there's a lot more instruction too. I mean, one of the best features of YouTube is like how to do things.
Totally. Yeah. And I use that all the time.
Yeah. And we all use it. And young people in particular are like, hey, maybe there's these tutorials online to figure things out. And I've actually been, let me back up a little and say, we often hear negative, comments about young people, and we hear Gen Z, oh, they have mental health problems. They don't know how to do anything. They're not good workers. They're lonely. You hear all these stories. Well, the news is, likes negative stories. Some of those things are legitimate concerns to worry about. But what you don't often hear is, I guess it doesn't make good news, is the stories of all the young people using technology not to become more miserable, but to your point, to get ideas and to figure things out. And I've been very, very impressed with, I'm around some young adults, and I'm been very impressed with how their financial literacy, for instance, is so much better than mine was when they watch videos to learn about how the stock market works, how investing works, how like crafty they can be. Again, they can watch videos. When you and I were growing up, you kind of had to have a mentor, or just trial and error if you wanted to do a home remodeling project. But now there's so much great information out there. So yeah, I think that speaks to another issue too, which is it's not zero sum. It's not, the internet's bad or social media is bad and this, and going offline is good. I think what we're seeing in our data when we ask young people their attitudes about various technologies is we're seeing that they're simultaneously very enthusiastic about innovation. They like how these things can improve their lives. Young people are buying vinyl records and CDs, but they're not getting rid of their Spotify accounts. They're saying, I want both. They're saying, I want the best of the convenience of modern digital platforms, while simultaneously appreciating that there's something about analog, physical media that has value. So we're seeing one of the main drivers of physical media purchases is young people who didn't grow up with that stuff. And they're having these experiences like, oh, Netflix took off my favorite movie. And now I can't watch it, or, I can't find this on Amazon. I can't even rent it on Amazon anymore. Maybe I should have a physical copy.
I have to. That reminds me that I totally messed up the introduction. Not related to you, but I was like, oh, a good thing for me to plug at the beginning of this for our vast listeners is a little startup that I am working on with a couple other people called Periodical. It's periodical.inc. And it's a little printed publication. And you log into periodical.inc with a K and enter in the Substacks that you like to read and whatever WordPress blogs that you get. And once or twice a month, we send you a your own physical bespoke magazine of it.
That's great. I love that.
It's so we're very early stage. We're still polishing the product. Everybody go sign up for it. It's great. We have a lot of work to do, but a thing that I've found early on is the vast majority of our subscribers are young people, like in their 20s or early 30s. It's and when I talk to people about it, it tends to be the older people who are like, "Why would I do that?
Yeah,
like, why would I want that. I can get it, online." But and many young people are that way too. But there's a group of them who are like, I would love to have that on my bedside table rather than looking at my phone.
Yes.
So anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's absolutely the case. And the data supports that. You see in surveys a lot of young people saying they would like to get physical catalogs, and they want to get physical mail. They want to get catalogs.
That's special now, like to get it.
Yeah, it's
special.
And I've even talked to some like car manufacturers that have talked about how there's, a desire to get back to knobs and, like the touch,
totally.
to like the tact. Yeah. So I think you are definitely seeing nostalgia play out in this way. But what's cool about it, is that it's never like, oh, we want to do it exactly the same. People aren't saying get rid of the internet. And the critics will, they'll try to force that dichotomy. They'll try to say, oh, so people don't realize how much the internet is important in their lives and they want to get rid of it. It's like, no, people don't actually say they want to get rid of it. They're trying to improve their relationship with technology. And they're saying there's a space, maybe they've gone too far in having everything mediated by their computers. And so they want to have some analog offline experiences, but they also still want the benefits of technological innovation. Like with the car thing, people might like the designs and the knobs and the things that you can feel, not just touch screens. They might want those in the cars, but they still want fuel efficient, safe cars. They don't you know what I mean? They don't want to go back to like a car without a seatbelt, for instance. And they
also would like a car that they can fix themselves.
Yeah. And that speaks to another point about nostalgia. Like when we were doing this Gen Z, I'm glad you brought that up, because when we were doing this Gen Z nostalgia research, a theme that kept coming up was control. And so young people are saying, with media content, for example, young people are saying, if I have the physical media, it's mine. I own it. I can play it when I want. I can use it when I want. I'm not relying on it being available on some digital platform and, in the cloud. I have it physically in my, and so there's this sense of control, to your point about working on things similarly, right?
Well,
it's like
agency too.
Agency. Yeah. So it's like I think that's a big theme of a lot of this kind of nostalgia, is regaining, especially if the world feels like it's changing very rapidly and you don't know your place in it and how you can exert agency over your life. There's this sense of, it's not a surprise that a lot of nostalgic memories have this sense of freedom to them. Like, oh, what, and why we're nostalgic a lot of times for our youth is this sense of like, oh, like I was doing, I was free to try things, to do things, to explore. I was adventurous. I was bold. I was, it's not a surprise that we want to reconnect with that as we get, throughout our lives when we feel overwhelmed.
Have you written on to that point? This is maybe kind of a woo-woo type question, but do you feel like we have, I'm just say what I feel. I'm not going to ask you that. Like, it feels to me like much of our nostalgia is a deep-rooted impulse to live as we are meant to live. That may be something that's evolved over a great many generations, hundreds of years, thousands of years, that over time we have this sort of inherited memory of what is the right way for us to live. And not to say that we should live in the past, but there are parts about our past that have been very, very positive, and we have an intuitive, natural reaction to them that's very, very positive, like we would have when we're walking in a beautiful forest, and it feels good to have that kind of access to nature, or when we're in a cool little market, and it's lively, and there's bespoke handmade goods all around. There's something about it that feels really, really special, that is kind of nostalgic. But I wonder if that's do you have any thoughts on that sort of woo-woo idea?
And I think that nostalgia puts us in touch with our humanity. To your point, it's a very human-oriented experience, and that's why I'm not surprised with the rise of artificial intelligence that you're seeing a growing interest in nostalgia as a way, again, not to reject innovation, but as a reminder, well, what makes us human? What is at the core of what makes life meaningful? And I think, to your point, relationships, like real engagement with other people, skills, developing ourselves in some ways, tactile. We are multisensory tactile organisms, nature. All these things that we kind of know are good for us. Nostalgia helps us like maintain contact with that at some level. So I definitely think that's the case. And in fact, like there's been some recent research. I wrote about this in one of my newsletters, within the last few weeks, about some recent research on how nostalgia increases a sense of self-humanity. And like it kind of, which defined as like this sense of what makes humans unique is our distinct cognitive and emotional lives of, we're moral organisms that, we care about right and wrong. We like to, we're not always rational, but we have the capacity for rational thought. We have this desire to have meaningful relationships with other people. And nostalgia like helps remind us of that humanity. So I very much think there is something to that. And that's not, like to your point, it's not people saying, I want to return to the past as it entirely was. I think people are perfectly able to balance a desire for progress to improve, to improve things, but to say progress also involves wisdom, right? It also involves understanding what worked before and making, and holding on to that and utilizing it in the present. And because progress involves experimentation and trying new things, sometimes that's not going to, sometimes the outcome's not going to be good. And so nostalgia helps us say like, okay, well, we don't have to accept that outcome. Like there's something that we can use from the past, to help us improve the situation. And so I don't see it as, people retreating to the past as nostalgia is often characterized. I see it more as people pulling the past into the present to help with the present challenges.
I like the way you frame that. It's not a retreat, but it's pulling forward these things that help us connect with our humanity and help us to live better lives. I wanted to, before I let you go, I don't really have a question about this, but I wanted to ask, I'm like looking at your background, I was immediately reminded of it. I'm sure you have a point of view on two movies that were like nostalgia in your face. And one was, or books too, book and movie. One was Ready Player One. And I imagine you have a point of view on that, or what it means, or the cultural significance of it. And then as I was thinking about that, and you talked about like, Gen Z, nostalgia being a very positive thing in the lives of Gen Z, given the rapidity of change and all those things. I was thinking about my childhood, and that movie for us was Back to the Future. And anyway, I don't have a question, but do you have a sort of, what are those types of films or art or books or whatever? Like, what's the cultural significance of those kind of things?
Yeah. I love both those movies. So one thing I really like about Ready Player One is, like you said, it is obviously, it's not a subtle nostalgia, right? But there's a lesson in there, I think, that's very consistent with the way I think about this, which is the end of, I don't think this is a spoiler. People, the movie's been out a long time, right? The end of Ready Player One, they sort of embrace a future in which, like, it's like they're not throwing out this technology, but there's like an explicit day where people aren't online anymore. There's like an understanding of, we're missing something from our kind of offline, in-person lives. Another movie, which I actually just rewatched the other day. I actually buy physical media. And I've been buying like Criterion Collection, like 4K Blu-rays, and I just bought WALL-E. And WALL-E is a similar nostalgic movie, right? Where it's, it's a very like, people are in the future in the space, but they've lost their agency and turned over their lives to technology. Everyone's overweight, floating around in these chairs. And even the AI running the ship is at battle, is trying to prevent them from returning to Earth. But there's a very nostalgic story there too of like, we can actually take control of our lives and maybe get back to the planet and rebuild it. And so, I like those. I like those movies because they often have that lesson of the point isn't technology is bad. The point is that we can't let technology control us. We need to use it to improve our lives, not let it control our lives. And so, I like those themes.
We're treating the technology, like I think about the end of WALL-E, really the credits scene, where they have kind of the Gary cartoon. It was a cartoon, but the cartoon.
Yeah.
It is as if they have, over the course of the movie, what the movie tells is a story of humans losing their agency and technology no longer being a tool for their use, but master's not quite the word, but the thing that determines their existence.
Right.
And they're able to put the genie back in the bottle is not the right way, but they're able to recapture technology and make it their tool again.
Right.
And while embracing their humanity. And a bit of that was, as you say, kind of the end of Ready Player One. There's a bit of that as well.
And there's obviously because sometimes people say, nostalgia in movies is a lack of originality, and they'll point to the worst examples of, like a reboot of a movie, and they're just like, they just remade it and it's not as good as the original. And there's certainly a lot of movies like that. Like because of the time I grew up in the 80s, I love movies like Red Dawn that they made made a new one. It wasn't that good, I didn't think.
Right. And the same with Dirty Dancing was like,
and Point Break, I think I think there was another one they made a remake of.
But I'll say the sequel to Blade Runner, I thought was amazing.
Outstanding. Yeah. So yes, absolutely. So that's what, and I always come back with those. I was like, of course people can do there's no nostalgia is not magic. It doesn't mean everything you pour it on is going to turn into great art. There's a lot of garbage nostalgic content out there, but there's also a lot of great content. One of my favorites, if not my favorite movie from this year, Sinners, was a very nostalgic movie, but very original, very creative.
Sinners?
Yeah.
Like People Who Sin? Oh, I don't even know this movie. Yeah.
Yeah, it's check it out. It's a movie about vampires and it's got all of the. I don't want to give anything. I'm hesitating because I don't want to give anything away about the movie, but it's the filmmaking itself is very nostalgic. You can see that the filmmaker is showing like his love for old movies, but within that is a very kind of nostalgic story that has these kind of supernatural elements. If you like horror movies, it's not like a really like scary horror movie, but if you like kind of like fun horror movies with a lot of great music in it, then like blues and country and Irish folk music, then I would highly recommend it. But it was a great example to me of a movie of somebody who's like, oh wow, this is really new. I haven't seen anything like this before. But there's so much nostalgia pouring through it. And
that sounds like a totally different movie, but did you see Baby Driver?
Yeah.
It occurs to me the same way, like this protagonist who is without roots.
Yeah.
And has tinnitus. The Baby Driver is through the music. He's creating his place in his home while he lives in this volatile world.
Yeah. And there's so many there's so many movies like that where it's not a reboot. It's just nostalgia is like subtly woven into it. And, that to me, that's often where nostalgia can be at its best, when it's kind of more subtle and you can just see how much the filmmaker has been influenced by the movies he or she loves. And, and is trying to show some like tribute to that in their own work. In fact, when I was working on the book Past Forward, I was interviewing different artists and entrepreneurs and people who are really trying to do very, very forward-looking creation. And they all had nostalgic stories. They all had stories about why they decided to do that, why they just got into that work and what inspired their creativity. And even, to your point about new country music, even new pop, rap, alternative type music is the artists are, they'll weave stuff in. Like, this is what got me into music. This is why I love music. And so even people who are really doing things that are very forward-looking, very innovative, very creative, trying to do something, or their goal is to do something original, their passion, like their nostalgic passion, really, really fuels those activities.
Mm-hmm. I feel like we didn't directly address on this, but it's when I began my career in architecture and construction and things like that, and and studied the modernists a good bit. They're very much like entirely have a break with the past. That's what we needed to do, was reject the past. We needed a new architecture, new world for the new man, industrialized man, and we needed completely reject what came before us and embrace something new. And a lot of this came out of like terrible 1800s total war in the late 1800s, and then World War I, sort of humanity's bad, we need to reform humanity. But and I think that's persisted in academia and among intellectuals and that sort of thing. But the reality is it's been very bad for us to reject, to try and detach ourselves from the past. And it's really, that's probably the thing that I really kind of resonated with, re-resonated with when I read that recent article that prompted me to reach out to you. But this is, we shouldn't be rejecting the past. Like, we can ground ourselves and find strength and inspiration and goodness and comfort and in a useful and a applicable way rather than a retreating kind of way.
Right. And to your point about nostalgia rootiness in our humanity, a lot of these kind of like social constructivist utopian kind of attempts of like, oh, we're going to start over and shape man in whatever image we want. These sort of blank slate views of humanity, they've all failed disastrously.
And brought great suffering and sometimes terrible death and
right.
brutality. Yeah.
So yeah, just as much, I would agree, obviously nostalgia can be used in unproductive ways, just like anything can. Science can be used in unproductive ways, and even physical exercise. There are people who actually like physical exercise in very unproductive ways. Yeah, so anything that's good for you can be abused, of course. And people sometimes use nostalgia in ways that aren't productive. But most of the time, for most people, nostalgia is used in a very healthy and productive way. Whereas to your point about this like postmodern kind of social constructivist view, like it's always disastrous because it's not rooted in like who we are, like in what makes humans tick. And so, yeah, I would agree with that. I hadn't really made that connection before to your point about like architecture, but I would say in general, that whole intellectual or academic enterprise of like postmodern kind of view of we can just, start from scratch, blank slate, build the humanity we want is always not just failed, but like you said, it's actually led to considerable amount of suffering.
Well, I think the observations you have about it are both really important and really hopeful, particularly because we hear so much negativity about the state of the world and the challenges for young people. And I found it particularly hopeful and accurate, and really grateful to you for chatting with me about it. Clay, before I let you go, can you share with folks where they can find your work and where they can find more about you?
Yeah. So the easiest way to find more about me and, find links to my writing is just on my website, which is just clayroutledge.com. But I write a weekly newsletter on Substack that anyone can subscribe to for free called flourishingfriday.blog. And, my employer is the Archbridge Institute. And so you can go to that website too and find, my writing and my work there. So those are probably the best outlets to find what I'm up to and what I'm thinking about.
Yeah. Well, we'll definitely link to those in the show notes. Clay, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you. I've really enjoyed the conversation, and it's been great to connect.